I am Brad Keelor. He is Brady Cox. Coming up next on Director's Cut, you're going to hear about the Prakash Lecturer this year, but you'll also find out why he went to the White House.
Now there was a time when you loved me so I couldn't run. Now you need to know.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Director's Cut. My name is Brad Keelor. I'm the director of the Geo-Institute, and that is why we call this show Director's Cut. Every single week, I sit down with a different GI member who tells us stories about themselves. They have stories about their lives. Some of them are personal, some are professional, but every single one of them, since the beginning, 150-something episodes, 100% are fun. If you like what you see today, and I think you will, you should click like, subscribe, and get notifications, and we will let you know every time we post something to the YouTube channel. What I left out, what I always say is if you don't know anything about the Geo-Institute, after you watch this today, cruise on over, let your fingers take you to geoinstitute.org, and there you will find out all kinds of things about our wonderful society, such as we have about 12,000 members, most of them are geotechnical engineers and or geologists, and that we are part of the American Society of Civil Engineers. Housekeeping aside, we welcome in the 2024 Shamshire Prakash Award winner and lecturer and faculty member at Utah State University. It is Brady Cox. Brady, welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. I'm excited to finally be invited, Brad. It's good to be here.
Well, let's address this up front here. We can't have all the cool people on at one time. You have to spread it out, you know?
That's true. That is true.
We have 10 questions for you, the same way that we do for everybody every week. And 2 of them are the same that we ask everybody. And yes, as usual, we start with one of those. Describe your job in 45 seconds.
Okay. Whenever somebody asks me what I do, the first thing I tell them is I'm an earthquake engineer. And if they inquire any further, then I'll give them more details. So then I'll usually say, well, I'm a professor. Okay, so I teach at, whatever. I've been at the University of Arkansas, the University of Texas, Utah State University. So I teach at the university. And then usually they'll say something like, well, what do you do? And I'll be like, okay, I'm a foundation engineer. I study soils and how they handle loads so that buildings don't fall down or bridges don't collapse. And I try and determine the forces that an earthquake will impart into a structure and make sure that it's safe for people to live inside. So that's kind of my generic answer. For a geotechnical engineering audience, I could get more descriptive. I could talk about site response analyses and subsurface imaging and soil liquefaction and topographic amplification, but we don't want to spend too much time talking about that kind of stuff, right?
Well, and we're going to get to a little bit of that in a moment. I want to follow up with this, though. That's really an interesting way to get into it with people. What's the weirdest question somebody has asked you? I guess it could be about your job or not about your job when you start describing to them what you do.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know about weird, but most people, when I say I'm an earthquake engineer, then they automatically assume I'm a seismologist or a geologist. And so they'll kind of want to talk about earthquakes in general. That's when the weird stuff comes out. Okay, a lot of people have some pretty crazy ideas about earthquakes and what causes earthquakes. So, but in general, I think people would tend to think that I'm a geologist. Yeah.
Which I think happens a lot with the geotech world. You probably have a lot of people watching this who can totally relate.
And that's fine. You bet.
We're going to get into some stories now. The hard-hitting questions on Director's Cut that we like to throw at people. And this is where we get to know everybody. This is where the magic happens. This seemed like a very innocuous question. And then when we started talking before the interview, it led down a road that I did not expect. That's where we're headed next. Brady, what's the most bored you have ever been?
So, as I said, Brad, I tend to not get bored. Like I had to think hard. I'm like, when have I really ever been bored? Like I can sit for hours doing the most boring tasks and not get bored. So I gave the example of ice fishing. Okay, I love to fish in general. Mostly I fly fish, but in the winter time when it's cold, I've been known to go and sit out on the ice for hours at a time and just sit there and fish. And so I was explaining how I don't get bored, and yet my family thinks I'm crazy. When I was first married, I took my wife ice fishing with me. And I'm not sure she was super excited, but one of my buddies, his wife was going as well. So she's like, okay, I'll go. But I mean, we got her ready. We had huge coveralls and big boots and hand warmers and toe warmers and all these layers of clothes. And she was taking a long time to get ready. So I'm like, honey, I'm going out on the ice. I'm going to go drill the holes. And when you're ready, just walk out there. So I was out on the ice drilling the holes, and my friend's wife actually starts yelling, and she's like, she heard something, and she turned around, and my wife had fallen through the ice. Okay? And so she had fallen through. She was holding on to the edge of the ice, and I was about 200 yards away or so. So I run back, and I get close, and I lay down on the ice, and I stretch out, and I grab her hands, and I'm getting ready to pull her out. And my buddy grabs my feet in case I fall in. So I pull her out. I saved her life, Brad, right? Like, I mean, totally, she owes me because I saved her life. And so I take her back to the car and start helping her get wet clothes off. And I get the car running and get it warm. And I could see that she's doing pretty well, not overly traumatized, So I'm like, okay, honey, take the car and go home, and I'm going to fish, and when I'm done, I'll come home, right? And I didn't think it was a big deal, but a lot of people are appalled that I would do that, including my wife. And and so that was over 20 years ago, and I will never live that down. So if any of you ever do that, make sure you don't abandon your significant other and drive them home if they fall through the ice. Okay, it's a piece of advice.
A couple of things here. One, this is an important safety thing for people who might live in a place where there's not a lot of ice. You did exactly the right thing to get her out of there. That is the method that you're supposed to use to pull somebody or something out of the water if they fall through the ice. Now, another thing, until we talked about this before we started recording, this little Midwestern boy had no idea that people out west went ice fishing. So that blew my mind. What do you catch when you go ice fishing out west?
Trout almost exclusively. Okay, so rainbow trout, cutthroat trout, those would be kind of the primary fish in Utah, but we have other species of trout, brown trout, tiger trout, stuff like that. Yeah.
Wow. So the Midwest and I guess the middle of Canada would be your pike and muskie and walleye. A lot of people like ice fishing for crappie in the Midwest, which whatever. But at the risk of turning this into the fishing hour with Brad and Brady, that is fascinating. Well, we like to cater to all our members within GI. That is excellent. The third question is always the research question, and you got kind of specific with this one when you got back to me. I didn't even know how to tee it up. This might be a "what have you been working on lately" kind of question, and you just run with it, Brady.
Yeah, I'll just run with it. So my research, the things that I'm most interested in presently. So subsurface imaging. I'm super interested in in situ testing, experimental testing. A lot of times that involves pushing sensors into the ground or putting sensors on the ground surface or a combination of both, and then sending waves through the ground. When I was at the University of Texas, working with Ken Stokey and the big shaker trucks, right? T-Rex and Liquidator and Thumper. And sometimes we just use a sledgehammer, but we're sending waves through. We're trying to develop a subsurface model. The reason I'm so interested in that is because I'm interested in the application for studying earthquake site response. I'm really interested presently at studying what we call borehole arrays. So arrays that have been drilled into the ground where we have seismometers at different depths, and trying to develop a numerical model of the subsurface and then propagate waves through that model and see if we can accurately predict what was measured at the surface by using an input that was measured at some depth below the surface, 100 meters below the surface or something like that. So really imaging to retrieve modulus and damping parameters, and then numerical wave propagation studies in order to predict earthquake forces on structures.
I think especially on the imaging, I think you and I are about the same age, and still the advances that have been made throughout the span of our careers are incredible. Like, when you look back at when you entered the field, is there anything that you do now that you think your 24-year-old self would have been absolutely just blown away by?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we're still trying to move away from 1D in geotechnical engineering, right? So a lot of the imaging we do is still one-dimensional. I think we've gotten to the point now where we've started to acknowledge uncertainty in our one-dimensional methods and have good ways to quantify that. And then we can, stitch together a couple of 1D images or 1D soundings and make a cross-section. But true three-dimensional imaging, even though we theoretically have the capabilities to do it, I think we still have a long ways to go. Now, in the medical world, it's crazy impressive, right? Like, I have 4 daughters. Like, I've been to the doctor's office 4 times where they put that ultrasound thing on my wife's belly and they look inside. And every time I would do that, like you said, the technology would get better and better. And it's just amazing. MRIs and X-rays and all kinds of imaging for medical purposes. And I can't take credit for this, but Ken Stokey used to always say, look, when you get older, you realize how much you like non-invasive testing. You don't like to go to the doctor and get that invasive stuff, right? So for geotechnical engineering, yeah, we're always going to need to do some invasive testing, but there's huge benefits to non-invasive testing. And the better we can get it looking into the ground in 3D and looking deep enough for engineering purposes, there's a huge future in that for sure. Void detection, tunnel detection, utility location, mapping irregular bedrock, mapping spatial variability in hard and soft soil layers. I mean, there's tons of work to do still.
That's the good stuff. I don't even know why I bother to try and write that question. Like I was saying, I should just let people talk.
There you go.
So we mentioned at the top, and everybody knows that you're teaching, and doing research. You're at Utah State, and you went there for undergrad. I feel like it's always got to be a little bit strange when you go back after some interval of time and not being there. So I wanted to ask, what's different at Utah State now or when you came back as a professor than you remember it as a student?
So a lot of it's the same, Brad. So there's a few faculty members here that I took classes from. The one that I miss a lot is Dr. Joe Caliendo. I mean, what a guy. that guy, man, I thought that's what it was like to be a professor. Like Dr. Joe would go every day and take guitar lessons from the music department, and him and Marv Halling would go for a run at lunch. And I was like, man, this professor thing is a good gig. I can take like guitar lessons and go for a run all the time. I didn't realize that you had to write proposals and papers and all that stuff. I thought it was pretty chill. So, yeah, things have changed. We have a new engineering building, but we also still have an old one. So my office right now is an office that I probably used to go to visit faculty members in, when I was an undergrad student.
So what made you want to go back? I think this is tough, right? Because you see it in sports, and the one that I always come back to is Ken Griffey, right? Ken Griffey really wanted to go play for the Reds, and he left that great situation in Seattle, and the second half of his career wasn't lost, but it definitely wasn't like the first half.
Yeah.
What made you want to go back?
Yeah, let's hope the Ken Griffey example doesn't hold for me.
Well, I think you've been there long enough already. I feel pretty good about your chances.
Oh yeah, I know, but I hear what you're saying. As I mentioned earlier, I've now I've been a faculty member at 3 different universities. I started at the University of Arkansas. Great place. It was such a hard decision to leave the University of Arkansas. I was there for 6 years, and then I moved to the University of Texas. And, to be at the University of Texas with just an incredible group of colleagues in geotechnical engineering, man, it was awesome. And I think a lot of people thought I had a loose screw in my head when I left, being a full professor at the University of Texas, a top 5 program in civil engineering, and then saying, I'm going to leave and I'm going to go to the Reds, so to speak, right? Or I'm going to go back to Utah State. It was a hard decision, really, really hard. A lot of it was personal, getting back to family. I'd been away from Utah for about 20 years. My wife's also from Utah. Getting back to the mountains was kind of an important thing for me. But, seeing an opportunity in Utah has a lot of very interesting seismic problems, earthquake engineering problems. I think they've certainly been studied, but they haven't been studied as much as they have in other places. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to get Utahns ready for a big earthquake. And I wanted to have a part in that for sure.
And you just walked us right into the next question. It's like we planned this or something. What's the number one thing, or even top 3 or whatever, that people need to know about seismicity in Utah?
Yeah, Utah kind of has some unique circumstances for sure. Here's a couple of interesting tidbits about Utah and earthquakes. So approximately 80% of Utah's population lives within 15 miles of the Wasatch Fault. Now that's kind of shocking. We built Interstate 15 right along the Wasatch Fault, north to south, and all the development along the Wasatch Front has occurred along that interstate. So that's a pretty shocking number. 80% of your population lives within 15 miles of a very major fault. That fault tends to produce characteristic earthquakes that are about magnitude 7-ish type earthquakes. And we're currently, by seismologist estimation, about 100 years overdue along the Salt Lake City segment, and maybe as much as 1,000 years or so overdue along a segment called the Brigham City segment. So we certainly are due for a large earthquake in Utah. Utah has 5 times the number of unreinforced masonry structures, 5 times more than California. So think about that. The size of California, the population of California, yeah. Utah has 5 times as many URM structures. And those are obviously the most deadly type of structure that you would prefer not to be in during an earthquake. Significant soil liquefaction hazards in Utah, soft, deep valleys and basins where we can expect soft ground amplification, topographic amplification in the mountains. So there's a lot of interesting and challenging problems in Utah that we need to work on.
Fascinating, though. I mean, I was impressed when I've been there a few times since, but when I was in Salt Lake City, I think it was in 2017 or 2018, I had some free time. And as I like to do, I went to the state capitol, and I knew that they had recently installed all those earthquake dampers. And so I asked one of the volunteers or one of the staff people there about it and told him that I was from ASCE. And within about 3 minutes, somebody is walking me down into the basement and showing me all this stuff. I mean, that's pretty great that was one of the first major structures in the state to be retrofitted like that. Has that helped you guys in your quest to get people prepared?
I mean, a little bit. Interestingly enough, I think the very first seismic retrofit in the state of Utah was called the City County building in Salt Lake. And that was a very, very early base isolation project. And then the Utah State Capitol has been base isolated. And then the most recent structure that's getting base isolated is the Salt Lake City Temple, or the LDS Church. And that is a crazy project. It's, to this date, I would say anywhere in the world, it has to be the most impressive base isolation project performed. And that will allow that large historic temple. There can be up to 5 feet of relative movement between the ground and the temple in any direction. That's pretty amazing. And it's a super, super cool project if you ever get the chance to hear about it.
That's called engineering tourism right there.
Yeah, it's
well
awesome.
Worth it.
Yeah.
So the other question we ask everybody when they come on Director's Cut is another simple one. How did you first get involved in ASCE and then GI?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as I've been told, the very first Geo-Congress was in Logan, Utah in 1997. That's what I've been told. I have a hard time finding proof for that, but
I will tell you, it is true.
Yeah. So that was pretty cool. That was organized by Lauren Anderson and Joe Caliendo, I believe, and maybe some others at the time. That would have been my first year as an undergrad at Utah State University. I don't remember it. Okay, obviously I wasn't focused in on geotechnical engineering yet. But a few years later, by 2000, I remember going to Geo Denver. Like, I had started a master's program at that time, and there were about 5 or 6 of my buddies, and we all did master's degrees in either structures or geotech. And we all went over to Geo-Congress in Denver. We rented a van, we drove over there. I remember eating at Rodizio's, and we were so sick, like we couldn't eat anymore. But that was a super cool conference. That was right before I traveled to Turkey for my master's degree to study the 1999 Kocaeli Turkey earthquake. And so I remember meeting Ellen Rathje at Geo Denver because she had to give me like a GPX file for one of those handheld GPS units that had like all the coordinates of these liquefaction failures that they had mapped out during the earthquake reconnaissance. And so that was kind of a funny experience, but Geo Denver was cool. I remember hearing like these people that I'd read about like in my foundation textbooks, right, as an undergrad, and seeing, as I recall, Harry Poulos was there and Ed Idris, and seeing these people and hearing them give talks after reading about them in my books, I was like, wow, this is cool. So that's probably my first real exposure to the GI, I would say.
It's kind of funny that you mentioned the handheld GPS units. We were just talking about these yesterday, how they lived such a short life. I mean, when you think about it, they were not around that long. I mean, I guess they're still around, but they're a super niche product for small communities now. I mean, that's another one. Like, when you look at earthquake reconnaissance then, or any disaster reconnaissance then, compared to now, like, what's the single biggest change to you?
Man, I remember in 2008 going to study the Pisco, Peru earthquake, me, Adrian Rodriguez Merrick, Joe Wortman, and we had our GPS units. You know, you look back at those old pictures and we always have a GPS like hanging around our neck, and we're keeping it on the whole time. We're keeping track of our breadcrumbs, so to speak, and we're marking positions. And I remember we were trying to study this big lateral spread, and we were like, we need satellite imagery. And we ended up tasking a satellite, like literally paying Geo-I1 like tons of money to fly over Peru to take satellite imagery so that we could get pre and post earthquake images to study this lateral spread feature. And it's just so funny now looking back. We thought we were really cool and like really high tech because we would overlay our GPS tracks on like a geo-rectified image, and now like that's just so simple and mundane. It's kind of funny.
Well, and some of that stuff too. I mean, you mentioned 2008. A lot of that type of technology within 18 months of that was just gone because you didn't need it anymore because you could do it on an iPhone.
Yeah.
You have competed in and completed an Ironman triathlon. Wow, I guess is the way you start with that. As somebody who's been a runner for quite a while, I've never even dreamed of doing anything like this. What was the toughest part for you of finishing the Ironman?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think everyone that contemplates doing an Ironman triathlon, they kind of, at least most people kind of dread the swim, right? So you start out with a 2.4-mile swim. That's a pretty long swim. But honestly, that's probably the easiest part of the day. You're fresh. It's a little interesting to swim with 2,500 other people and to consistently get punched and kicked in various places on your body. I remember I was a few hundred yards into the swim, and I stopped for a minute to clear my goggles. They kind of fogged up, and I stop, and there's people bumping into you, of course, but I look in front of me, and there's kind of this older gentleman, and he's like doing the backstroke. And he's swimming perpendicular to the course. And so I was just laughing. I'm like, this is absolute crazy. There's foam and arms and body parts flying everywhere, and you're in the middle of it, and some guy's doing a backstroke. I'm like, dude, it's going to be a long day for you, man. So, but the swim wasn't too bad. You got to train for it, obviously. Open water swimming is interesting. The bike, it's a long day on the bike, 112 miles. So you better be prepared to sit on that bike seat for 5, 6, 7 hours. But honestly, it all comes down to the run at the end. And by then you're pretty tired. And I did mine in Houston, Texas, and it was a pretty warm day. And I did pretty well for the first 12 to 14 miles. Like I was feeling pretty solid, like holding to the pace I wanted. And then I literally dropped the plow, started plowing up the field, planting crops behind me. I slowed down big time. So that was hard. I got super dehydrated. At the end of the race, I went back to the hotel room, and my wife had to peel my contacts out of my eyeballs because I was so dehydrated. And get this, I got the hiccups that night, and they didn't go away for 2 days. Okay, so I don't know, whatever I did to my body was kind of rebelling a little bit, and they're like, okay, I'm going to give you hiccups for 2 days. And that was not fun at all.
So I feel like we've talked about similar things in other episodes. It always goes back to the same place where so much of this is mental, right? And it's not even just summoning like the strength or the courage or whatever to finish. At some point, like you said, when you slowed down, you have to accept this, right? Because you've got your goals, you've got what you've been working for. And even when you just go out for a run on a regular day, most people kind of have a target. And you don't always get there. Like especially when you were in that race, how did you get to the point where you were accepting of what was happening and just you were going to finish and that was going to be good enough?
Yeah, I knew that I wasn't going to meet my time goals, but for me, it was like, I'm finishing this race, like failure is not an option. And so no matter what, I was going to finish that race. And it was pretty awesome. Yeah. You just got to do it.
So from one very cool experience to another, and I'm guessing they didn't make you run during this one, you got to go to the White House.
I did. Yeah.
Not an experience that a lot of people get to have. What was the most surprising thing about it? You got to go to receive a Presidential Early Career Award. It was during the Obama administration. What surprised you about the White House?
I mean, just walking into the White House is super cool, right? Like going in where most people don't get to go. So just being there was awesome. Meeting President Obama, he's pretty tall. If you look at the picture that I have, it's actually hanging in my wall up here, and I'm definitely looking up at him as we shake hands. He was a pretty funny guy. He was joking about wanting all of us nerds to tutor his daughters. I remember that. So that was pretty cool. But one of the most interesting thing is when we got to the White House, we were in the East Wing of the White House, and we were there for a photo op, right? Like we're going to stand on kind of all these almost like bleachers, and there was 100 of us or something maybe that had gotten this award, various sciences and medicine. Anyways, Obama was busy doing something, right? President Obama, and he was late. So we were just all wandering around the East Wing of the White House, and they told us that we could not take pictures. And so we're all just walking around, and they did allow us to keep our phones. And so after a minute, like there was a Secret Service guard there, a lady, and she was, at some point she told us that we could take pictures. And after that, everybody broke out their phones and we were all taking pictures, and we got to sit on the old furniture. Like we were in the red room, the green room, the blue room. There's all these old pictures of presidents and first ladies and busts of Abraham Lincoln. And, it was just super cool to be in there. And that was really fun to be able to take some pictures. And I looked back at my pictures not too long ago, and man, they weren't very good pictures. And I wish I would have gotten.
Well, I wonder, part of it is like how comfortable with you with the whole experience, because I mean, even for me, I live here. I've lived here a long time. My whole adult life, I've been in the DC area. I've been in the White House a handful of times for work. I don't know that I've ever felt at ease in there. You constantly feel like you're going to do something wrong and that somebody's going to come up to you and you're going to get in trouble and you're going to get thrown out. I mean, how comfortable were you that day?
Yeah, probably not very comfortable, but it was exciting. We're like, oh, look at this old piece of furniture. I'm going to sit in that chair right there. And
That's cool that they let you.
cool. Yeah, like I went back the next day. They let us bring one person with us the next day to do the standard tour of the White House. And on that tour, we got to walk through the East Wing again, where we had been the day before, and it was all cordoned off.
Yeah.
You had to walk between velvet ropes, and they had carpet laid out that you couldn't deviate from the path. And I was telling my wife, Audrey, I was like, I sat on that chair yesterday. Yeah.
It is. That's a good story because it's also really funny. I've been in the same kind of situation, not there, but in other places, and it's almost like nobody believes you. Like,
Yeah.
I think my kids are like, sure, you got to do that, Dad.
Yeah. But that was a really, really neat experience. I got to take my parents to Washington, D.C. My dad was a coal miner, and, I grew up in a little town. So when I got that award and I got to go to the White House and meet the President of the United States, like I was like, I got to take my parents. They didn't get to go to the White House, but I've got pictures of my parents in DC, outside the Capitol building and all the monuments and memorials. It was just a super cool experience. Yeah.
That's awesome. One thing I had to ask, I've got 2 kids, boy and a girl. We feel very fortunate that there's one of each gender. You've got 4 daughters. And
Yeah.
anybody who has all their kids are the same gender, and anybody who's in that situation has my undying admiration, because it seems very challenging. It doesn't matter whether it's boys or girls, but if they're all the same gender, it just seems tough. What have you learned from having 4 daughters?
How much time do we have? Okay, I'll speak a little facetiously for a minute. What have I learned? I've learned that I dress like an old man, okay? That I shouldn't wear running shoes all the time. So here's an example, okay? I'm gonna stand up. This is a little off topic, but over Christmas, they made me get some Nike Air Force shoes, okay? Because we were wandering around the, shopping mall or whatever, and they're like, "Dad, you dress like an old man. Like we need to spice up your wardrobe, okay?" So that's one thing I've learned, that I'm lame, I guess. Another thing that I've learned is that I'm an unemotional brute. Yeah, that's one for sure. I don't know about brute, but I definitely am not as in tune with my feelings as my daughters happen to be, and my wife probably. But my daughters are awesome. I love them to death. They're great. They're a lot different than me. They're also parts of me and them, obviously, but they keep me pretty grounded. They don't give a who I am at work at all, right? They don't care what I do. They just want me to be a good dad, and so I think that's important to have people in your life that'll bring you down to the level that you deserve to be at.
And help you get cooler clothes and shoes. I mean,
Totally.
that's
Yeah.
really important. And I feel like I've been in the same spot many times. That's, I'm sure many of our viewers have too.
Yeah.
One final question here. We haven't talked about the Prakash Lecture really at all yet. Of course, you will be giving the second GI Prakash Lecture in Vancouver at Geo-Congress 2024 in just a few weeks. This is a lecture award that was established last year, and it's for people under 50. It's a great way to get new people up giving the lectures, and you're going to get a good audience out of it too. Brady, what was your initial reaction to getting the Prakash Lecture news?
I was super excited, obviously. I mean, it's an honor to receive recognition from your peers, and it's an honor to be considered for something like this. There's always tons of great candidates, right? So you feel when you're lucky enough to be selected that, there's plenty of good people that could have been given the award. I have no doubt. I remember Shamshir Prakash. I remember meeting him at some early GI conferences, and a few years ago, I think maybe it was 2015 or 14 or something, but I received the other version of the Shamshir Prakash Geotechnical Research Prize, and I got this pamphlet right here. Okay, so just a little preview for my lecture. I'll be hopefully recreating some of these poses and showing you guys how well I do during my lecture at Geo-Congress next month. And Shamshir has been sponsoring this type of stuff for a long time, and his foundation has been pretty instrumental, and a lot of pretty well-known people have received recognition because of his generosity, I would say.
That is a cool answer. And if people weren't looking forward to the lecture already, which I'm sure they were, now they are really looking forward to it. That is fantastic. Brady, you made it through all 10 questions. You did a great job of it. And for our viewers, you made it through too, as you do every week. If you liked what you saw, and you probably did because you are here at the end, again, click like, subscribe, and get notifications, and we will let you know every time we post something to the YouTube channel. Brady, thank you again for doing this.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It was fun. Super easy and fun.
Nobody ever says it's easy, so I'm glad you threw that in. That's important. Let it be known. And for all of our viewers, we'll see Brady again in just a few weeks, of course, at Geo-Congress. You can get more information on the conference at geocongress.org. And for Director's Cut, we will, of course, see you with another brand new episode next week. How did I don't even know what to ask you about.
Yeah.
I've never asked anybody about being a worm picker before. So
Yeah. So when I was in 6th grade, I started picking worms in the alfalfa fields across the highway from my house. So I lived in a pretty rural area, and I think it was my dad's idea. Like, we were going to sell worms to make some extra money, and it would be a good experience for the kids to take this on, right? So from the time I was in 6th grade to after I graduated from high school, I think I kept doing it for a year while I was working on an associate's degree in my little hometown area. But yeah, I sold worms. I would go into the fields at night with a light on my head, and when they would irrigate, I would pick night crawlers, like big worms, not little ones, and I would put them in a milk jug that I'd cut the top off of, so it just had the handle and kind of a big hole. And I can tell you, Brad, it takes about 600 night crawlers to fill up a gallon milk jug. And when you dump out 600 worms out of a milk jug, it's not for the faint of heart to see that, for sure. And I would sell them for $1 a dozen. And I had a sign that would hang outside my house, and it would advertise night crawlers, $1 a dozen. And fishermen would come to my house, and they would open up a fridge and pull out a styrofoam cup with a dozen worms in it, and then they'd put $1 into like this metal bin. And I would make about $2,000 a summer.
that's pretty solid.
So you can do the math. 12 worms times 2,000 plus a pretty high death rate amongst the product. And I picked a lot of worms in my life. Semi-pro. Haven't done it for a long time though.
But in Michigan, for me growing up, I know you could buy them. Pretty much every store had a fridge with night crawlers in it. Like, that was just a thing.
Yeah.
And you could buy them on the side of the road and stuff.
Yeah.
And it never crossed my mind, how did these get there? Where did they come from? And I'm sure it was a similar kind of thing where they were picked off of some, I don't know what crop it would have been, because they're not going to destroy corn or soybeans or anything, but it had to be the same kind of deal. Oh, that's a really good story. I like that.
That was my first exposure to geotechnical engineering. Not really, I was just playing in the mud, but
So now the Marvin Joe bread. I mean, you told a great Joe story back there. What's your experience with the Marvin Joe bread? I mean, you're still there. You could literally go eat it every day if you wanted to.
I could go get a Marvin Joe. Marv Howling of Marvin Joe, his office is just a few doors down from mine. He's the department head now. He was a relatively juniorish faculty at the time, and Joe Caliendo kind of took him under his wing. Marv was a structural engineer. Joe was a geotech. And anyways, they would go over to the student union And Joe Caliendo would always ask for this particular type of bread. He was a vegetarian, at least in the later portions of his life. And so he made up this kind of vegetarian sandwich. Okay, and you can look up the recipe online if you want to the Marvin Joe. Just type in Marvin Joe in Google and it'll come up, Marvin Joe USU. But yeah, like they invented it, as I recall, when I was an undergrad student. Okay, I think you mentioned Aaron Budge and Rob Moss, and those guys were graduate students at Utah State at the time. But yeah, I can't say I go get it every day, but Marv has a card that he can show, and it's like lifetime free Marvin Joes. Yeah, lifetime. So he can go over to the student union anytime and show that card, and he gets a free Marvin Joe. True story.
That is amazing. And part of me says, why do I ask every single Utah State person about the Marvin Joe when they come on? But it's because there's new information every time. This is the first I've heard. This is fantastic.
Yeah, I'll see if I can send you a picture of the Marvin Joe card. I have to get it from Marv Howling. He carries it in his wallet, so it's with him all the time.
That's a winner.